They told me to let it go. My own daughter, standing in my kitchen with her perfect manicure tapping against the counter like a metronome of dismissal, said those words as if forgiveness were a button you could press and everything rotten would suddenly smell of roses. I was 78 then, old enough to know that some silences don't heal. They ferment. I live alone now, in a small adobe house on the outskirts of Albuquerque. The evenings are long, but the quiet is clean. I make tea at sunset and watch the desert light slide across the walls. Sometimes I talk to the cactus on the porch. It listens better than my own blood ever did. When she said it, I didn't answer. I just wiped the counter, the way you do after someone spills something sticky, carefully, deliberately, so it doesn't spread. I didn't want her to see my hands tremble. She thought I was angry about money or pride or the petty accounting of a long marriage. But it wasn't that. It was the look on her face when she said it. The certainty that peace was better than truth, that comfort mattered more than conscience. She believed that silence was love. Maybe that's what we taught her. Maybe that's what I modeled all those years of folding the sharp edges of my voice so her father wouldn't feel small. You see, in our family, men were allowed storms. Women were expected to mop up afterward and smile. I met her father, Thomas, when I was 21 in a public library where he came to return a book he hadn't read. He was tall, disheveled, charming in that distracted way men have when they believe the world owes them understanding. I was a clerk with ink stains on my fingers and a secret belief in fairness. He told me he liked my seriousness. I mistook it for respect. For 47 years, I called that misunderstanding love. Through illnesses, funerals, mortgages, and graduations, I carried the weight of his moods the way some women carry heirlooms, carefully, as if breakage would be a personal failure. By the time my daughter told me to let it go, Thomas had already rewritten half of our life. Small omissions at first, a joint account quietly closed, a conversation I supposedly forgot, a house sold without my signature because he claimed I'd agreed months earlier. Every lie had a smile attached to it, the kind that made other people trust him and made me look unreasonable. When I brought up inconsistencies, he laughed gently and said, "You always make things so dramatic, Maria." That's how they do it, the ones who build their innocence from your self-doubt. They shrink your reality until you start apologizing for noticing. My daughter thought she was helping. She thought she was saving what was left of a marriage that had been eroding since before she was born. I don't blame her. The world teaches women to keep the peace, even if it kills them slowly. She told me, "Mom, you're too emotional. It's just money. Dad's getting forgetful. Don't humiliate him." Forgetful? He remembered every password, every account number, every transfer that left my name off the papers. But I bit my tongue because the alternative was losing her too. When you are an aging woman, everyone assumes your pain is confusion. They call it grace when you swallow it quietly. That night, after she left, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bowl of lemons I'd bought earlier that day. They were bright and cold, almost theatrical against the blue ceramic. I remember thinking that if I stayed silent, those lemons would outlast me, perfect and useless. So I wrote in my notebook, just a sentence, nothing heroic. I will not let it go. It wasn't rebellion. It was self-preservation. You must understand, I wasn't always this alone. There was a time when my house was full of noise. 3 children, 2 dogs, a husband who whistled through his shaving routine. I cooked for 6 every Sunday. I hosted birthdays, packed lunches, ironed clothes that no one thanked me for. I built a family like people build cathedrals, stone by stone, quietly, for the glory of others. And still, when the foundation cracked, they told me to smile and sweep. The day after that conversation, I found an old photograph wedged behind the refrigerator. A picture of me holding my daughter at 3 years old, her hand gripping my necklace, both of us squinting against the sun. I looked at that young woman, me, before the compromises, and wondered what she would think of the stranger I had become. Probably she'd scold me for waiting this long to notice. When you reach a certain age, people stop expecting transformation from you. They assume the shape of your life is fixed, like a vase that's already been fired in the kiln. But they're wrong. Sometimes in the last act, a woman remembers she still has hands. That day, I took off my wedding ring. My fingers were swollen from arthritis. It took effort. When it finally slid off, I felt a pulse of pain so physical, it startled me. Not grief, not loss, release. By evening, I had made tea, opened the window, and listened to the wind scrape against the stucco walls. The desert light turned the kitchen gold, and I whispered to no one, "I won't let it go." The phrase didn't sound defiant. It sounded true. Maybe that's why I kept repeating it, quietly, until my voice steadied. The truth is, I had spent my life letting things go. Opportunities, dignity, arguments I should have won, apologies I never received. I had let go of friendships that made my husband uncomfortable, of jobs that demanded too much, of dreams that required more room than he allowed. But that night, at 78, I decided to hold on to what was mine, to what was right, to myself. People think the hardest part of betrayal is the act itself. It's not. It's the disbelief that follows, the chorus of rational voices telling you to move on, to forgive, to protect the illusion of harmony. My daughter believed she was keeping the family together. What she didn't see was that the family had already fractured, quietly, invisibly, in all the years I said nothing. The silence had been the real violence. When the tea cooled, I wrote a second sentence beneath the first. Tomorrow I will start remembering in order. That was my rebellion, memory as protest. I didn't know then that it would save us all, though not in the way she imagined. I only knew that pretending wasn't peace, and forgetting wasn't forgiveness. Now, years later, when I sit on my porch at dusk, the air smells of sage and dust. The mountains blush pink in the distance, and the coyotes start their song. I think about that night often, the first time I refused to be reasonable. I can still hear her voice, sharp with youth and fear. "Let it go, Mom." And I can still feel the quiet that followed, thick as syrup, almost sacred. Because that was the night I chose truth over decorum, the night I stopped performing gratitude for people who confused my endurance with consent. That was the night my life began again, quietly, the way dawn begins, unnoticed at first, then unstoppable. The next morning I woke before the sun, the kind of gray hour when the air itself seems undecided. I made coffee in the dented pot Thomas always hated because it sputtered. He used to say it made the kitchen smell cheap. I liked that smell. It meant life was still happening. I sat at the table with my notebook open, the one where I had written, "I will not let it go," and waited for the caffeine to steady my breath. The house felt foreign, like a hotel room after the guests have checked out. Everywhere I looked, I saw the outline of his absence, yet he was still sleeping down the hall. I could hear his uneven snore, that small, smug rhythm of a man who still believed himself unshakable. When I decided to look for the truth, I didn't picture a battle. I imagined paperwork, quiet inquiries, the soft shuffle of folders in an office with humming fluorescent lights. But betrayal, I learned, isn't tidy. It spills into corners you didn't know existed. It stains things you thought were safe. I started by gathering small clues, receipts, bank notices, letters half buried in the drawer he called his miscellaneous. At first it felt petty, sneaking through his desk like a thief. Then I realized I wasn't stealing. I was reclaiming. The first real shock came from a manila envelope wedged between old tax forms. Inside was a letter from a brokerage firm addressed only to him, congratulating Mr. Thomas Rivera on his successful transfer of assets to a family trust located in Nevada. I stared at the date. It was 6 months after our 50th anniversary, the same week he'd given me a gold bracelet and toasted to forever. My hands shook so badly I nearly tore the paper. The trust listed one beneficiary, not me, not our children. A name I didn't recognize, Marianne Cole. At first, I thought it was a clerical error. Then I saw the neat signature, his handwriting, confident and unmistakable. He'd written it as if she were destiny. I folded the letter and slipped it into my cardigan pocket like contraband. I didn't cry. Tears would have been easier. Instead, I felt the slow numbness of recognition, that cold settling that comes when reality stops pretending to be kind. I spent the rest of the morning moving through the house like an archivist, collecting traces. He had always mocked my love of order, but that day it saved me. Every document told a story, each one trimmed of my name, each one a small erasure that had gone unnoticed because I'd been too busy making dinner, keeping the peace, letting things go. When he finally woke, I was sitting on the couch with the television off. He asked why I looked so serious. I said I was thinking about calling the bank, that there'd been a mix-up. His expression flickered, barely, but enough. He shrugged. "You worry too much, Maria. I'll handle it." Then he kissed my forehead, a gesture so practiced it felt like forgery. That kiss was the catalyst. In that moment, I understood that the man I'd loved was capable not just of lying, but of doing it gently, almost tenderly, to make me doubt the evidence of my own eyes. I waited until he left for his weekly chess club, which I later learned was nothing of the sort. I dressed slowly, choosing the blouse he used to call my interrogation outfit, pale blue with tiny buttons that refused to stay fastened. I took the bus downtown, something I hadn't done in years. Albuquerque looked different from a bus window, less predictable, more human. At the bank, I spoke with a young woman named Janine, who had the kind of patience that can't be faked. She printed statements, pages and pages of them, and each page was a quiet slap. Withdrawals, transfers, credit lines, all signed by him alone. I asked how long this had been happening. She bit her lip. "Looks like 2 years, ma'am." 2 years. While I'd been cooking soup for his bad back and defending him to our daughter, he'd been moving the life we built into someone else's name. I thanked Janine, folded the papers into my purse, and walked out into the noon glare. The light hurt my eyes. It wasn't grief that made them water. It was exposure. When I reached home, his car was already in the driveway. He was in the kitchen, pouring himself whiskey into one of the crystal glasses I'd inherited from my mother. "Where have you been?" he asked casually. "Downtown," I said. "Had to clear up a few things." He smiled without warmth. "Always fixing something, aren't you?" I placed the envelope on the counter between us. "I know about the trust." For a second, he froze. Then the old charm switched on like a lamp. "Maria, sweetheart, that's business stuff, tax efficiency. You wouldn't understand." But I did understand. I understood that the man who once read me Neruda under streetlights now considered me an obstacle to be managed. He kept talking, stringing together explanations that smelled of panic. When I didn't respond, his tone sharpened. "You're being paranoid. Our daughter was right. You need to stop making problems out of nothing. There it was again, the sacred phrase of dismissal. Nothing. I picked up the glass of whiskey and poured it into the sink. The smell rose between us like old fire. This isn't nothing, I said quietly. This is my life. He left the room muttering about overreactions, about how age made women suspicious. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of the ice melting in the sink. Then I went to the bedroom, opened my drawer, and took out a small wooden box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were the deeds, the insurance papers, the few things still bearing both our names. I placed them beside the bank statements. That stack of paper looked pathetic and sacred all at once, a museum of survival. That night I couldn't sleep. The ceiling fan clicked in uneven rhythm, the kind of sound that drives the mind into loops. I kept seeing the name Marianne Cole printed in neat black ink. Who was she? A woman, yes, but more than that. A mirror, proof that I could be replaced, refiled, rewritten out of existence. Sometime after midnight, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would not confront him again. I would document everything, methodically, silently. I would become my own historian. Over the next week, I met with a lawyer, a woman named Ortiz, who wore no jewelry and took notes with mechanical precision. She spoke little, but when she did, her words cut clean. After hearing my story, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Mrs. Rivera, you're not crazy, you're consistent." That sentence nearly broke me. Consistent. After months of being told I was confused, irrational, emotional, someone finally described my clarity as sanity. She helped me open a separate account, guided me through copies and affidavits, told me to keep quiet until the evidence was unassailable. I left her office lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because it had a name. When I returned home, Thomas was watching television, a talk show where people confessed things for applause. He barely looked at me. I studied his profile, the thinning hair, the familiar line of his jaw, and I felt an emotion I hadn't expected. Not hatred, pity. Because for the first time, I saw the smallness behind his control. He needed to be admired the way others need oxygen. Without the performance of respect, he would suffocate. I, on the other hand, had learned to breathe in silence. I went to the kitchen, wrote his name and the date on a slip of paper, and pinned it to the inside of my notebook. It wasn't vengeance, it was chronology. Every truth deserves a timestamp. And as I turned off the lights that night, I realized something that would guide the rest of my days. The moment you stop accepting confusion as proof of loyalty, you become dangerous to every lie around you. That was the beginning, the real beginning. Not the marriage, not the children, not the decades of quiet service. The beginning was that morning in the bank, when a stranger handed me proof that I still existed on paper. Everything after that was motion, consequence, and eventually salvation. After the visit to the lawyer, life in the house resumed its familiar rhythm, but the air around us had changed. Thomas still read the newspaper every morning as if the world waited for his approval, still made small comments about the neighbors' lawns, still tapped his spoon twice against his cup before drinking his coffee. Yet I could feel him watching me between the folds of those habits, the way a cat watches a door it knows will open. He sensed that something in me had tilted, though he couldn't name it. I was careful. I cooked the same meals, kept the same schedule, smiled when expected, but inside the movements a second life began to breathe, quiet, patient, deliberate. The first sign of his unease was almost laughable. He began leaving little notes for me around the house, Reminders, he called them, about when the bills were due or when to water the plants, as if I hadn't run this household for half a century. Each one, it was control disguised as concern, a way of reasserting the balance he felt slipping. I threw none of them away, just placed them in a drawer next to the bank statements. Every act of supervision became part of my archive. Our daughter came by one Sunday afternoon, carrying a store-bought pie and a tired smile. Thomas greeted her with a cheerfulness that felt performative, and I knew he wanted her to see a version of domestic calm. She looked at me across the table, searching for signs of unrest, but I gave her none. When she asked if everything was fine, I said yes, my voice even. She seemed relieved, as if my composure absolved her from asking more. We ate the pie in small slices, talking about her work and her children, all the while circling the silence in the center of the room. When she left, she hugged her father first. He held her longer than necessary, and when she finally turned to me, her embrace was light, polite, something between acquaintances. I watched the car drive away and felt a thin film of sadness settle over the evening, not because she had gone, but because I realized how far she already was. That night, Thomas suggested we go through our papers together, for clarity. I nodded, pretending not to hear the tremor beneath his calm. He wanted to know what I had seen, what I might say, how much damage I could cause. I told him I trusted him completely. The lie tasted like medicine, bitter but purposeful. Later, while he showered, I copied another set of documents, slid them into an envelope, and placed them beneath the lining of my sewing basket. I imagined him rifling through my drawers one day and finding nothing but buttons and thread. The thought gave me a strange comfort. For years I had hidden fear. Now I was hiding evidence. Days stretched into a kind of twilight. We spoke less, moved around each other carefully, two actors unwilling to drop their cues. Sometimes he brought me flowers, daisies or carnations from the grocery store, gestures of forced normality. He placed them in a vase and said, "See, we're fine." I nodded. I watered them dutifully and watched them wilt. When petals began to fall, I pressed one between the pages of my notebook, a quiet record of performance. In the evenings, he poured his whiskey earlier, 2 fingers at 5 o'clock sharp, then 3, then 4. The television filled the house with the voices of strangers. I took to walking in the backyard after dinner, counting the stars, letting the night wind cool my anger into something usable. Once he joined me, standing a few steps behind, pretending to admire the sky. "You know," he said, "you've been different lately, quieter." I told him age makes everyone quieter. He laughed, not believing me, and went back inside. I stayed until the mosquitoes found me, tracing constellations I didn't know the names of. The darkness felt honest. It was around that time that I began forgetting small things on purpose. I left his mail unopened, missed a few calls from his associates, burned the toast. Each act of imperfection was a small rebellion. He noticed, of course. "You're slipping," he said one morning, handing me a piece of paper with a list of reminders. I looked at the neat handwriting, the small boxes he'd drawn for check marks, and said, "Maybe I am." The confusion in his eyes pleased me. He couldn't tell whether I was apologizing or warning him. At night, when he slept, I reread the letters from the bank and the copies Ortiz had made. The papers no longer frightened me. They steadied me. Proof has that effect. It gives form to what gaslighting tries to dissolve. Sometimes I imagined confronting him publicly, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. There's a power in waiting, in letting your adversary believe he's still in control while you prepare the ground beneath his feet. One evening I found him in his study talking on the phone, voice low, urgent. When he saw me, he ended the call too quickly. "Work stuff," he said. I smiled. Of course. But I noticed the flush on his neck, the way he shielded the desk with his body. Later, when he went to bed, I opened the drawer he'd been guarding. Inside was a new folder labeled Consultations. Dozens of printouts, emails, property valuations, notes from meetings with a financial planner. He was preparing to move more assets. My name appeared only once, in a line that read, Spousal Acknowledgement Pending. Pending. Such a tidy word for theft. I closed the drawer quietly. Every secret he hid confirmed my own. The subtle cruelty grew thicker, like humidity before a storm. He began correcting me in front of others. Small things, dates, names, whether we'd seen a movie or not. You're mixing things up again, he'd say with a smile, and our friends would laugh politely. I laughed too, because to protest would invite the accusation of hysteria. Inside, I cataloged each remark. I noticed how easily charm becomes ridicule when power feels threatened. There were moments, however, when fear nearly outweighed resolve. Once during breakfast, he reached across the table, covered my hand with his, and said, I know you've been talking to someone. His tone was soft, but his grip was firm. You've always been terrible at secrets. I met his eyes and said, So have you. He let go slowly, the faintest crack appearing in his composure. For the rest of the day he was solicitous, making me tea, offering to fix the leaky faucet, calling me dear. Apology by performance again. I played along. Sometimes survival looks like complicity. The daughter called that weekend. She asked if I'd forgiven him yet. I said there was nothing to forgive, only things to understand. She sighed, told me I was exhausting, and hung up quickly. Her loyalty wasn't cruelty, it was convenience. It's easier to side with the storyteller than with the evidence. After that, her calls became less frequent, her messages shorter. The house grew quieter, but the quiet belonged to me now. In that silence, the worst realization arrived. Not that he had betrayed me financially, but that he enjoyed the performance of benevolence. Every time he carried my groceries or complimented my cooking, it was a rehearsal for the audience of our world. He wanted to be seen as the patient husband of an aging, difficult woman. The narrative was already being written, and I could feel the walls tightening around it. I understood then that truth wouldn't survive in this house unless I took it outside. The lawyer's words echoed in my head. You're consistent. Consistency, I realized, is a kind of weapon when the world insists on your confusion. So I began preparing quietly. I packed a small folder in my purse, copies of the key documents, my identification, the spare house key. I kept it near me at all times, even when I gardened. The folder was thin, but its weight was immense, each sheet a reminder that I was still accountable to myself. From the outside, nothing had changed. From within, everything had. He still poured his whiskey, the neighbors still waved, the sun still set behind the same desert ridge. But I had stopped reacting. I was observing, recording, waiting. It's astonishing how powerful a woman becomes when she no longer seeks reassurance. One night, weeks later, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The face staring back looked older, yes, but steadier. The lines around my mouth no longer seemed carved by grief. They looked like marks of authorship. The story was shifting, and this time I was the one writing it. I turned off the light and whispered, not in anger, but in conviction, not much longer. The shift began so quietly, I almost missed it. Nothing exploded. No one screamed. There was just a single morning when the world around me looked sharper, the edges cleaner, as if someone had opened a window in a long-closed room. I woke to the smell of dust and coffee, and realized that I no longer felt like a guest in my own house. Thomas was still asleep, his breath shallow and uneven, the sound of a man untroubled by conscience. I watched the sunlight crawl across the floorboards, touching the same rug I had chosen 30 years earlier, the one he always said clashed with the walls. For the first time, I saw it differently, not as evidence of bad taste, but as a piece of my stubbornness that had survived every correction. It was a small revelation, but that's how transformation starts, not with grand gestures, but with the recovery of ordinary things. I spent that day cleaning drawers, a task that might have seemed domestic, but was in fact ritual. I found an old cassette buried beneath a pile of sewing patterns, the label faded but still legible, Spring Recital, 1985. It was my daughter's first piano performance, the one Thomas had missed because of a meeting. I still remembered the dress she wore, yellow with a crooked hem, and the way she looked toward the empty chair in the second row, waiting for a father, who never arrived. I placed the cassette in the old player that barely worked and pressed play. The sound was warped, thin, but her hesitant notes filled the kitchen like ghosts of optimism. When the recording ended, I sat for a long time without moving. I realized that I had spent my life excusing absences, his, mine, everyone's, and calling that forgiveness. That was the moment the balance inside me shifted. The next step would not be survival. It would be agency. I began to walk each morning before sunrise, slipping out of the house while he still slept. The neighborhood at that hour was almost tender, sprinklers clicking, dogs yawning behind fences, the smell of baking bread drifting from somewhere unseen. I walked without destination, only distance. Sometimes I rehearsed what I might say to him when the confrontation finally came. Sometimes I said nothing at all, letting the rhythm of my steps replace words. Movement became proof of existence. Each block I covered was a sentence in a new language I was just beginning to learn, the language of self-direction. One morning, at a small cafe near the edge of town, I met a woman named Evelyn who ran the place with her sister. She was around my age, with silver hair and the confident impatience of someone who has long since stopped apologizing for taking up space. She poured my coffee and said, "You're new here, but you walk like someone who's been deciding something." I smiled, startled by her accuracy. We talked for a while, about nothing and everything, recipes, the drought, the absurdity of men who think charm is currency. When I left, she handed me a card with the cafe's number on it. "In case you ever need work," she said. I didn't, not then, but I kept the card. It felt like a key to a door I hadn't yet dared to open. Back at home, Thomas had started watching me with an anxiety he tried to disguise as affection. He asked where I went, who I talked to, whether I'd remembered to lock the gate. Each question was a probe. I answered calmly, never the same way twice. The uncertainty unsettled him. The more he sought control, the less of it he had. I noticed how easily power unravels when met with measured stillness. One evening, as he asked yet again about my errands, I said, "I'm making a record of our life." It was true, though he took it for nostalgia. He laughed, relieved. I laughed too, because the record I was making would one day undo his fictions. The lawyer, Ms. Ortiz, continued to guide me with the precision I came to depend on. She showed me how to collect signatures, where to send certified letters, which dates mattered. Her office smelled of lemon polish and quiet determination. "Keep everything in order," she said. "When the time comes, truth must look organized." That sentence stayed with me. I began labeling folders not just for her, but for myself. Assets, accounts, correspondence, memories. The last one was purely symbolic, filled with copies of old photos and bits of paper that reminded me who I had been before his narrative rewrote me. Slowly, I stopped seeking conversation with Thomas altogether. The silence between us, once suffocating, became a kind of sanctuary. He mistook it for surrender. I let him. He invited friends over again, men with loud opinions and women who smiled too quickly. During those dinners, I played the role he expected, the aging wife with selective hearing, nodding politely, serving wine. Yet under the table, my fingers traced the seam of an envelope hidden in my skirt pocket, a reminder of what waited beyond the performance. Each evening I excused myself early, claiming fatigue, and once upstairs I wrote down every detail of the night. Names, comments, transactions mentioned in passing. I was no longer his audience. I was his witness. Then came the afternoon that confirmed my transformation. I was sorting laundry when I heard a dull thud from his study, followed by a groan. I found him sitting on the floor, clutching his knee, the whiskey glass shattered beside him. "It's nothing," he said through clenched teeth. For a moment, instinct took over. I almost rushed to help. That's what decades of caretaking do. They turn reflex into prison. But then I saw the cold calculation flicker in his eyes. He was waiting for pity, the old currency. I handed him a towel for the spill and said evenly, "I'll call someone," meaning a doctor, not myself. His face tightened. I said, "It's nothing." I nodded and left the room. In that small act of withholding rescue, I felt the first real pulse of freedom. Compassion is sacred, but it dies when used as manipulation. After that day, something in him deflated. He became quieter, cautious, as if walking through his own house required permission. I didn't gloat. I simply occupied the space he had once colonized. I played music in the mornings, jazz, sometimes classical, and let it spill through the hallways. The sound unsettled him. He said it made it hard to think. "Good," I replied gently. "It's supposed to." The music wasn't rebellion. It was reclamation. Every note reminded me that life had texture beyond restraint. Evelyn from the cafe called one evening. "We're short-staffed on Fridays," she said. "You ever think about getting out of that house for a few hours?" I hesitated, then agreed. The following week, I began working 2 mornings behind her counter, wiping tables, refilling cups, learning the choreography of simple independence. I didn't tell Thomas. I didn't owe him that knowledge. The money was minimal, but the weight of it in my pocket after each shift was revolutionary. I bought my own groceries, my own coffee, even a new notebook, one with thicker pages for the next chapter of my record. By the time he noticed my absence, the pattern was irreversible. "Where have you been?" he asked one afternoon. "Walking," I said. "You walk a lot these days." "It helps me remember where I'm going." He didn't understand the double meaning. He smiled thinly, muttered something about midlife crises. He refused to see that my midlife had passed decades ago and that this was something different, a late bloom of truth. He poured his drink and turned back to the television. I went to the porch, sat under the spreading light of the evening, and felt a calm I hadn't known since girlhood. That, for a woman who had spent half a lifetime trapped in past and future, was the rarest form of liberation. For weeks I believed that calm was the new normal, that I had carved out a quiet space no one could enter, that the worst had already unfolded, and all that remained was endurance. It is astonishing how quickly illusion rebuilds itself when you are tired of vigilance. The house settled into patterns again. My early walks, his whiskey at 5, the evenings where we barely spoke but shared the same room out of habit. Yet beneath that surface something thickened. It was not peace. It was pressure, slow, and invisible, gathering under the floorboards like gas before a spark. I should have known that truth never stays polite once it has been woken. It began with the mail. Envelopes arrived addressed only to me, but when I came to collect them, they were already opened, resealed poorly with clear tape. When I asked, he said he was helping, that he worried I might miss something important. His concern came with a smile too tight to be kind. Then the phone calls started, numbers I didn't recognize, voices that hung up when I answered. One evening, the lawyer called to confirm the appointment I hadn't told anyone about. I heard the faint click of the extension upstairs. The line went dead a second later. I stood there with the receiver against my ear, listening to the static, and understood that he had crossed from suspicion into strategy. The next day, I moved my documents to a box at the cafe. Evelyn didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and said, "People who hide proof in their own homes never win." She was right. Safety, I learned, often requires a witness. My daughter visited soon after. She arrived unannounced, carrying flowers and a brittle smile, the way people do when they've been briefed before a conversation. She walked through the house as if taking inventory, complimenting the curtains, touching the photos, avoiding my eyes. "Dad says you've been distant," she finally offered. "He's worried." I laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that doesn't sound like amusement. "He's always been worried about appearances," I said. Her jaw tightened. "You're doing it again, Mom." Turning everything into a drama. She called it drama. I called it memory. I told her there were things she didn't know. She cut me off before I could continue, her voice sharp with exhaustion. "I don't want to hear accusations. You've both made mistakes. Please just let it go before it destroys what's left." There it was again, the family's favorite lullaby. Let it go. She left the flowers on the table, lilies already beginning to brown at the edges, and drove away. I didn't move for a long time. The scent of those flowers filled the kitchen until it made me dizzy. Later that night, I threw them out, one stem at a time, each drop of water hitting the sink like a clock marking the end of something unnamed. After that visit, he grew bolder. He stopped pretending not to search. I would come home to find drawers slightly misaligned, papers shifted, my sewing basket disturbed. Once he confronted me outright, holding a folder he had found hidden behind my winter coats. "What is this?" he asked. I looked at the folder, then at him. "Evidence," I said simply. For a moment I saw the flash of fear, quickly replaced by disdain. "You've lost touch with reality," he said, voice low, controlled. "You're sick and someone needs to look after you." I remember thinking how quickly love turns into diagnosis when a woman stops agreeing. He tried to take the folder from my hands, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said, quietly, but with something final in the tone. He hesitated. The silence that followed was dense, metallic. He left the room without another word. That night, he slept in the guest bedroom for the first time in years. The house felt split along its spine. The following morning, I went to the cafe early. Evelyn poured coffee without comment and slid a small envelope toward me. "Keep this," she said. Inside was a set of spare keys to the back door and a note with her home address. "If he ever locks you out, you come here." The gesture undid me more than any kindness in recent memory. There is a kind of generosity that doesn't pity, it recognizes. I realized I had found, almost by accident, the beginning of another kind of family, one that required no permission. By late autumn, the situation had become a performance. He told friends I was forgetful, that age had softened my judgment, that he managed the finances now for her own good. People nodded sympathetically, relieved to see a man behaving responsibly toward his frail wife. When neighbors asked how I was, their tone already carried the answer, "Poor woman, losing her grip." I smiled. Let them believe it. Disbelief is camouflage. At night I wrote down every comment I overheard, every date, every small cruelty disguised as care. My record grew thicker, and with it, my steadiness. I began to understand that truth collects mass. Once it's heavy enough, it doesn't need defending. One evening near the end of October, he called the family to dinner. A rarity. Our daughter came with her husband, our son with his, both of them weary from long drives and already tense. He opened wine, toasted to new beginnings, and spoke about retirement, about simplifying things, about moving assets into proper management. He used the word "we" generously. I listened, my hands folded in my lap. When he mentioned transferring the house title, something inside me settled with cold certainty. He was still moving the pieces, still convinced that charm would outlast evidence. The conversation blurred around me. I caught fragments: tax relief, efficiency, security for the children. My daughter looked confused but not alarmed. My son nodded, eager to avoid conflict. When the toast ended, I excused myself, claiming a headache. Upstairs, in the privacy of the dark, I realized that the battle was no longer about money or property. It was about authorship of the story. Whoever told it first would own the truth. A week later, I found a letter on the counter addressed to our children, sealed but unmailed. Curiosity overcame dread. I opened it carefully, read, and felt my pulse slow to something steady and strange. It was a statement of concern, a declaration that their mother was becoming erratic, that he feared for my safety, that he was considering legal guardianship. The paper shook in my hands, but my mind stayed calm. I saw now how perfectly the trap was being built, the narrative of the confused old woman, the benevolent husband stepping in to protect her. It was elegant in its cruelty. I folded the letter, placed it back exactly as I'd found it, and knew what had to come next. Protection would not come from silence. That evening, while he was out, I called Ortiz. "It's time," I said. She didn't ask what I meant. Within days, she arranged to have official documents filed, contesting transfers, freezing accounts, securing my share. The process would take months, but the motion itself was liberation. When I hung up, I realized I wasn't trembling. I brewed tea, sat by the window, and for the first time in years, felt no fear of the dark. He must have sensed it. The next morning, his politeness was unbearable. He made breakfast, asked about my sleep, complimented my robe, every gesture too practiced, every smile stretched thin. I saw through it, but played along, the way one humors a child hiding behind a curtain with his feet visible. After breakfast, he asked if I was happy. The question startled me. I said yes, and he laughed softly, an exhale that carried disbelief. "You don't look it." I looked him in the eye and replied, "That's because you stopped recognizing the expression." He blinked, uncertain, and for a moment we were simply two people facing the sum of years. Then he looked away. The weeks that followed were thick with waiting. Letters from lawyers, subtle shifts in accounts, small rumors traveling through family lines. My daughter called again, voice trembling between worry and anger. "What are you doing, Mom? Dad says you're suing him." I told her it wasn't a war. It was correction. "You're tearing us apart," she said. "No," I answered quietly. "I'm showing where the tear began." She cried, accused me of stubbornness, of pride, of living in the past. I let her speak until she ran out of words. After we hung up, I felt both grief and clarity. Children, even grown ones, cannot stand to see the myth of parental unity collapse. It makes their own stability look invented. She would understand one day. Maybe. Winter came early that year. The air turned sharp, the sky metallic. Inside the house, the distance grew physical. He on one side of the corridor, I on the other. Sometimes we passed each other without acknowledgement. Sometimes we exchanged small courtesies that felt like negotiations between foreign states. One night I caught him in my study, standing over the desk. "Looking for something?" I asked. He straightened too quickly. "Just curious what keeps you so busy." "Paperwork," I said. He nodded, stepped closer, and for the first time in decades, I saw genuine uncertainty in his eyes. "You think you can win," he said quietly. I almost smiled. "It isn't about winning. It's about ending the story where it should have ended years ago." He stared at me for a long time before leaving. The door clicked shut with the soft finality of a seal. After that, the house itself seemed to shift allegiance. The light fell differently. The rooms felt larger, as if the walls had exhaled. I took to writing in the living room, spreading my papers across the table he once guarded as his command center. It felt like reclaiming territory. I even bought a small plant, a stubborn green thing that refused to die no matter how cold the nights became. Each morning I watered it, whispered a single word, almost, because that's what it felt like, almost freedom, almost peace, almost safe. The day it all came to a point was not dramatic from the outside. The sky was pale and uncommitted, the air still, the kind of morning that feels too calm to be trusted. I woke before dawn, the habit of an anxious heart, and sat for a long time in the half-light, listening to the house breathe. Somewhere a pipe ticked, a branch scraped the window. I realized that I no longer flinched at these small sounds. They belonged to me now. The silence, once so heavy, had changed allegiance. It waited for my words. I had an appointment that day at the courthouse with Ortiz. The papers were ready, the accounts frozen, the motion to separate assets already in motion. All that was left was my signature. I dressed carefully, not out of vanity, but ceremony. I chose the navy dress that Thomas had once called too severe, the one I wore only to funerals. It seemed fitting. Something was being buried. When I reached the hallway mirror, I saw a face I recognized, but hadn't truly met for years. The lines were the same, the eyes steadier. I pinned up my hair, applied a faint shade of lipstick, and whispered, "You look capable." It wasn't flattery. It was acknowledgement. Downstairs, he was already in the kitchen, reading the paper he pretended to understand. He looked up when he heard my shoes. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his tone light, almost conversational. I could hear the restraint behind it, the effort to sound casual. "Downtown," I said. "Errands." He folded the paper slowly, placed it on the table, and stood. For a moment, I thought he might block the doorway. Instead, he reached for the coffee pot, poured a second cup, and set it in front of me. "Stay a while," he said. "We never talk anymore." It was almost tender, that invitation, but tenderness from him had always come with a price. I sat, not because I was persuaded, but because I wanted to see what performance he would choose this time. He started speaking of practical things, taxes, weather, the neighbor's new fence, yet underneath ran the current of plea and accusation. When his voice softened, it was the softness of a net. "I don't understand why you're doing this," he said finally. "We've built a life together." I looked at him carefully, the way one studies a familiar ruin, trying to remember what stood there before collapse. "You built a life," I said quietly. "I maintained it." The distinction hung in the air like dust. He shook his head, muttered something about bitterness. "You're not yourself anymore." I smiled. "I know." And with that I stood, took my purse, and walked out. At the courthouse, the world moved with bureaucratic indifference, metal detectors, echoing hallways, the murmur of other people's disputes. Ortiz met me by the elevator, her briefcase clutched like a shield. She guided me through the steps, initial here, sign there, witness here. The sound of the pen on paper was unexpectedly intimate, like closing a door gently, but for good. When it was done, she looked at me with something between respect and relief. "You've done the hard part," she said. "Now the rest follows process." Process, such an unromantic word for liberation. Still, it fit. Freedom doesn't arrive with music. It comes as paperwork properly filed. When I stepped outside, the sun was blinding. The plaza was noisy with traffic, children, pigeons, life, indifferent and whole. I stood for a moment, breathing in air that tasted like metal and citrus, and felt the lightness of an irreversible act. There was no triumph, only quiet correctness, the sensation of something finally aligned after years of being slightly off-center. I walked to the cafe, my safe harbor, where Evelyn greeted me with a look that needed no explanation. She poured coffee, slid a small pastry toward me, and said, "So it's done?" I nodded. "Good," she replied. "Then start eating for yourself again." We sat in silence, two women of a certain age sharing the luxury of unsupervised time. When I returned home that afternoon, his car was gone. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a battlefield, but an empty stage after the play has closed. I moved through the rooms, touching the furniture, the walls, the edges of the picture frames. I opened the windows wide. The air smelled of dust and possibility. On the table lay a note in his handwriting, brief and careful. "You win. I hope you're happy." I read it once, folded it, and placed it in the drawer with all the others. It wasn't victory. It was record-keeping. People who believe in winning rarely understand what peace looks like. That evening, I took the ring from the jewelry box. It had been years since I wore it. Still, its weight surprised me. I turned it over in my hand, remembering the day he'd slipped it on my finger in a city park under cheap fairy lights, promising we'd never make each other small. Promises are easy at the beginning of sentences. It's the punctuation that changes meaning. I walked outside, the desert light bruised with sunset, and buried the ring at the base of the green plant by the porch. No ceremony, no speech, just the quiet press of soil. When I straightened, I realized I was not crying. The absence of tears felt holy. Inside, the clock struck 7. I made tea, real tea in a pot, not the hurried mug I'd grown used to. The steam fogged the window. The smell of chamomile filled the room. I sat at the table where so many silences had been served and opened my new notebook. On the first blank page, I wrote, "Today I ended pretending." Then, underneath, the story continues but under my name. The handwriting was uneven but firm. Somewhere outside, a train passed, its low hum echoing across the desert. I thought of the years I had lost to accommodation, to the art of shrinking. They were gone, but I was not. I was still capable of beginning. Later, when darkness settled, the phone rang. My daughter's voice trembled on the other end. "Mom, he says you've taken everything." I listened to the panic, the confusion, the guilt of a child caught between myths. "Not everything," I said. "Only what was mine." She was silent, then whispered, "Are you okay?" I looked around at the house, breathing quietly around me, at the open windows, the soft clink of cooling porcelain. "Yes," I said, and meant it. For the first time, yes. We talked for a few minutes more, cautious but tender, the first bridge rebuilt on truth. When she hung up, I sat for a long time with the receiver still in my hand, feeling the vibration of connection linger like a pulse. That night, I went to the window and saw the first light touching the mountains. It looked like forgiveness, though not of him. Forgiveness of myself for staying so long in a life that mistook endurance for grace. I turned from the window, ready to begin the smaller tasks, the dishes, the laundry, the ordinary rituals that, for the first time in years, belonged entirely to me. The house was mine, not because the law said so, but because every corner now carried my decision. The world hadn't changed, but I had, and that, I realized, was the only kind of victory worth keeping. The weeks that followed were slow and almost tender, like the recovery of sensation after a long sleep. The silence that once frightened me became companionable, a presence rather than an absence. I began to notice the sounds I had ignored for years, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the front step, the distant barking of a neighbor's dog at dusk. They formed a kind of music that belonged only to this house, and for the first time in a lifetime of shared space, the rhythm answered to me alone. Freedom, I discovered, is not noisy. It is the quiet permission to think without fear of interruption. I spent my mornings on the porch, a cup of coffee cooling between my palms, watching the light crawl across the desert. The plant I had buried the ring beneath had grown taller, a few pale blossoms opening like cautious eyes. Sometimes I imagined that the ring was dissolving into the soil, feeding the roots, transforming metal into nourishment. It comforted me to think that even what bound us could become fertile once returned to the earth. On certain days, my daughter called. At first, her voice carried that wary politeness we reserve for fragile people, but gradually it softened. She began asking about recipes, about the garden, about whether I needed anything from town. I knew she was still struggling to reconcile the image of her mother with the woman who had refused to remain silent. But love, when it is real, adapts. We were learning to speak again, this time without scripts written by someone else. One afternoon, she visited with her youngest daughter, the one who had only ever known me as the quiet grandmother at the edge of family gatherings. The child ran through the rooms as if discovering hidden treasure. "It's so big," she said, touching everything. I smiled, watching her move freely in a space that had once felt like a cage. My daughter stood in the doorway, hesitant. "It feels different here," she murmured. "Lighter." I nodded. Maybe the walls finally learned to breathe. We laughed, a small sound, but it filled the air with something warm. When they left, I found a drawing on the kitchen table, a simple sketch of me watering the plant. The words at the top, in a child's uneven hand, read, "Strong Grandma." I placed it on the refrigerator, held by a single magnet shaped like a heart. I looked at it often, not out of pride, but out of wonder at how children sometimes see truths adults avoid. The neighbors, once full of pity and gossip, began to greet me differently. They waved without that tilt of the head reserved for tragedy. Some even stopped by for coffee, curious perhaps about how a woman could begin again so late. I told them nothing dramatic, only that time has a way of returning ownership to those who wait without surrender. In their eyes, I could see a mix of admiration and fear, the fear of realizing that endurance is a choice, and so is escape. I didn't blame them. Not everyone wants to know how much agency hides behind quietness. Occasionally, I still thought of him. Not with longing or hatred, but with the detached tenderness reserved for a story that has been fully read. I wondered where he lived now, whether he still pretended to understand the newspaper, whether he ever told himself a version of our life where he was the victim. It didn't matter. Every person edits their own history to make sense of their reflection. Mine, at last, no longer required omission. The anger had burned itself clean, leaving something resembling peace, raw, imperfect, but honest. I didn't forgive him. I simply stopped needing him to answer. In early spring, I returned to the cafe to see Evelyn. She greeted me with a grin, poured coffee without asking, and said, "You look lighter." I told her about the plant, about the granddaughter's drawing, about the quiet that no longer felt empty. She listened, nodding slowly, her eyes reflecting a recognition beyond words. "You kept your promise," she said. I smiled. "Which one?" "The one you didn't know you were making," she replied. We sat for a while watching the morning customers come and go, both of us aware that ordinary peace is the rarest kind of wealth. When I got home that day, I opened the windows wide and let the wind move through every room. The air carried the scent of rain and sage. I walked from room to room, touching the furniture, the walls, the familiar objects that now seemed to hum with quiet loyalty. In the living room, the late light fell on the table where my notebook still lay open. I picked up my pen and wrote a final entry. They said it would destroy the family, but families built on silence are already broken. The truth didn't destroy us. It cleaned the wound. I closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf beside my favorite novels, and felt the strange satisfaction of completion. That night, as the first stars appeared, I brewed tea and stepped onto the porch. The desert stretched out before me, vast and unjudging. I thought of all the women I had known, friends, neighbors, strangers in waiting rooms, each carrying her own unspoken story. I wished I could tell them that it is never too late to be the author instead of the footnote. Perhaps that is what I would leave behind, more than the house or the garden. The proof that reclamation doesn't belong to youth. It belongs to whoever is tired enough of erasure to begin again. The sky darkened. The coyotes began their distant chorus. I sat in the quiet, listening, my hands wrapped around the warmth of the cup. The house behind me glowed softly, alive, ordinary, mine. Somewhere inside, the clock ticked, a sound that once marked waiting, but now marked living. I smiled, not because everything was healed, but because nothing was hidden anymore. The night was wide, the air kind, and I whispered into it a promise meant for no one and everyone. I let it go, but only what needed letting go.